Stonehenge in England was finished around 4,400 years ago using stones from a stone circle in Wales which was made 1,000 years earlier. Bella's Knapp Long Barrow was made around 5,000 years ago. New Grange Barrow in Ireland was made around 5,200 years ago. And Cairnholy in Scotland was also made over 5,000 years ago. In fact, all the megalithic monuments in the British Isles date to no more than about 5,200 years old. But in France, where the tradition originates, there are some as much as 7,000 years old, and even some of the gigantic barrows of Brittany are close to 6,800 years old. Even the thousands of megaliths comprising the Carnac alignments, which stretch for over 4 miles long, are more than 6,000 years old, making them close to 2,000 years older than Stonehenge. In this film, I will travel to France to see them for myself and to trace the origins of the mysterious megalithic culture to explain where these people came from and why they began erecting such enormous monuments which never fail to impress us even today. I'll also be taking a look at their exquisite jadeite axe heads to see how these may provide insights not only into the culture of these ancient people, but also into the meaning of the megaliths themselves. Our journey begins a bit closer to home, in Cornwall.
Stone monuments of the Neolithic, the megaliths. The first thing that comes to your mind, stone circles, like these ones. These are also in Cornwall. They're called the hurlers, and there's 3 stone circles here. The big 2 ones up there are linked by a stone path, which was a kind of a procession route. And actually, you'll see similar things of that sort in Brittany. This is the archetypal Neolithic stone monument, a perfect circle. Although, in fact, they're not entirely perfect. One of them's sort of oval-shaped. But they didn't just make circles. They also made stone rows. Just a line of stones like this one. This one's called 9 Maidens, and we're in Cornwall, in southwestern England.
Besides the 9 Maidens, there are other stone rows in Britain, such as Merivale at Dartmoor, or the larger so-called procession path of West Kennet Avenue in Avebury.
The thing that's really special about stone rows is that they appear to be one of the earliest of the megalithic monuments. And the entire tradition of megalithic monuments that arose in the late Stone Age in Western Europe appears to have begun in what's now Brittany in northwestern France. And Carnac boasts one of the most impressive of all the megalithic monuments in the world, which is a series of stone rows like this one here, but much bigger.
Megalith is Greek. It literally means big stone. But how did this monumental tradition of using enormous rocks begin, and how far back does it really go? To find out, I'm boarding a ferry to France, where it all began.
Au revoir, Angleterre. Now we cross the ocean blue to France to find the oldest megaliths and trace this tradition back to its inception, to the oldest megalithic structures in Europe. The people who built those were more familiar with this ocean than I am. They were avid travelers, very capable maritime culture. And we know that despite the fact that there are no boats preserved in their archaeological record, but we know they were because of the extent of their culture across the North Atlantic. And because they built so many of their megalithic structures, especially in Brittany, close to the sea.
These megalith monuments aren't limited to Britain, Ireland and France. They are found all over Western Europe, with high concentrations in Iberia, and in the previous film I visited some impressive monuments in Portugal, such as the Great Dolmen of Zambujeiro and the Cromlech dos Almendres. Some people used to think the megalith culture originated there. By the late 18th century, most people believed the stone circles and dolmens had been built by Druidic Celts, but now we know they are much older. From the 19th century, experts started saying the megalithic culture had spread to Europe all the way from the Near East. Some argued that Brittany received the megalith culture from Iberia to the south, while others, such as Baron Anatole de Bonstetten, claimed in 1865 that the culture spread in the opposite direction from Britain southward, and a similar view was repeated by the Marxist archaeologist Gordon Childe as recently as 1929. But once radiocarbon dating was invented, we could really start getting accurate dates. But you can't carbon date a stone monument, so the technique relies on nearby organic material like bones, which are not always available. The first tests from the 1960s onwards hinted that rather than being an imported tradition from the Near East, the oldest monuments may be those of Brittany in northwestern France. And as early as 1976, Sir Colin Renfrew suggested Brittany's megalith phenomenon grew out of the interaction of Mesolithic hunter gatherers and incoming farmers. Now, thanks to advancements in genetic science and archaeology, recent studies have proven that the people of Neolithic Western Europe did indeed originate in Anatolia, but they did not bring a megalith tradition with them from the Near East. Rather, the early European farmers invented the tradition here in Brittany during the late Stone Age, over 1,000 years after they arrived in Europe. A study by Paulson and colleagues in 2018 attempted to finally get some proper, reliable carbon dating of megalithic monuments around Europe, and basically confirmed that the phenomenon was a Western European invention that began in northwestern France between 6,000 and 7,000 years ago, and then spread across the Atlantic really quickly in just 200 or 300 years, perhaps as part of a new religion. Brittany had large earthworks up to 280 meters long around 4,900 BC, demonstrating massive social organization. They're the only large earthworks in Europe that directly precede megalith construction, and later megaliths are often associated with accompanying earthworks. The custom quickly spread north and south along the Atlantic coast into Britain and Iberia, while also jumping into Sardinia, and then spread by land into the French interior and up into Scandinavia, and finally experienced an early Bronze Age revival in Italy and Sicily, and even Britain. But this revival is associated with another race, the Belbeker people, rather than the original megalith builders of Anatolian origin. It is clear from the spread of the culture along the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and from evidence of gene flow along the Atlantic, that the megalith builders were proficient seafarers. Comprehensive radiocarbon dating has revealed that the first megalithic structures were simple grave monuments called dolmens, and these were built in France, Iberia, Corsica and Sardinia from around 4,800 BC up until around 4,000 BC. In Brittany, the tradition was more brief, lasting maybe just 200 or 300 years. But of all these regions, Brittany is the only one with the earlier monumental earthwork tradition that the dolmens could have grown out of. Although these dolmens now just appear to be rocks, they were originally also earthworks, that is, earthen barrows covering stone kits and pits. However, the Passy graves from the Paris Basin are the earliest dated monumental graves in Europe, likely as old as 5061 BC, with the next oldest appearing in Brittany later on, particularly around Carnac. The enormous Barrow of St Michel at Carnac is dated no older than 4782 BC, so it must be at least 200 years younger than the Passy graves, but is evidently a much more significant monument.
There's a 17th century chapel built on top of it, and still room to spare for another chapel if they wanted one. Was actually erected in the mid-5th millennium BC, most likely around 4700 BC. Like many other tombs in Brittany, this barrow is associated with the polished jadeite axe heads from the Italian Alps. In fact, 13 of them were found inside of this barrow.
Other graves in Brittany may well be older.
Behind me, you can see a 15-meter high barrow known as the Barrow of Tumiac, but also as the Barrow of Caesar, because of a local legend which holds that Julius Caesar himself, during his campaigns against the Gauls 2,000 years ago, stood atop this great barrow and addressed his troops from it. It could be true. We don't know. At that time, the barrow was already thousands of years old. But there again, we don't really know, because unlike as with some other barrows, we haven't been able to obtain any reliable carbon dating from the contents of the barrow. But what has been found within the barrow: a great number of variscite beads, likely from Iberia, and 18 polished jadeite axe heads, great value, imported all the way from the Italian Alps. Certainly, this is a testament to the wealth and power of the kings of this region during the Neolithic. Based on the style of the barrow, it seems to be one of the earliest of the giant Carnac types. So tentatively, we might date it to the mid-5th millennium BC, or maybe, if it really is, as some believe, the more primitive of the giant mounds, it could be the first half of the 5th millennium BC, making it, the earliest of them all, of the larger kinds at least.
Therefore, we can either conclude that the tradition began in the Paris Basin and spread to Brittany, or, if we consider the local earthworks that precede the monumental graves, then it seems more likely the tradition began in Brittany. It's important to note that genetic evidence reveals that the megalith builders were not descended from a single group of migrants from Anatolia, but rather two separate waves, one which spread westward along the Mediterranean and up into France, and the other which headed north through the Balkans and spread along the Danube towards Germany, where it became the linear pottery culture. Genetic evidence from the early 7th millennium cemetery at Gourgy in the Yonne Valley on the southeastern side of the Paris Basin shows that the two cultures mixed together again here after having been separated for about 1,000 years. These graves are close to the first monumental graves at Passy, which is also in the Yonne Valley. And neither of these cultures were pure Anatolians by this stage, as each had mixed with the indigenous European hunter-gatherers known by geneticists as Western hunter-gatherers. The early farmers in the south of France had over 30% hunter-gatherer ancestry, while those further south in Portugal were about 21% native, and those in West Germany were 39% native. The megalith tradition has no earlier precedents among LBK farmers in Germany, nor among the farmers in the Mediterranean. So there remains a possibility that the old theory of Colin Renfrew from the 70s, that the tradition has its roots in the indigenous Mesolithic customs of the native hunter-gatherers, is actually true. Now, according to this theory, rather than developing from the Passy graves of the Paris Basin, the tradition was native to Brittany and is exemplified in Mesolithic hunter-gatherer burials at Tumiac and on the island of Hroëck, both of which used quarried stone slabs in the grave structures. The large slabs were placed on top of the corpses and were also supported by a structure made from deer antlers. Perhaps when the first farmers reached Brittany 7,000 years ago, they were suitably impressed with the traditions of the blue-eyed natives and decided to copy them and improve on them. Only a couple of centuries separate the crude hunter-gatherer tomb on Hroëck from the giant barrow of Saint-Michel, 30 kilometers away. It's worth mentioning that even Stonehenge was built on the site of a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer holy site made of timber poles, and that genetic analysis of the elites in Ireland's giant megalithic tombs, such as Newgrange, has revealed that they were inbred and not only descended on their paternal lines from the dark-skinned, blue-eyed Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who preceded the first farmers, but also, despite being of mostly Anatolian descent, exhibited these same physical traits, which may have been bred into the elites through the practice of inbreeding, which kept their bloodlines precious. Could the entire megalithic culture have been based on preserving some sacred knowledge associated with the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Western Europe? I made another video which explores this further if you'd like to learn more. It is likely the diverse forms of elaborate megalithic passage tombs found around Europe developed from the early dolmens. The earliest accessible megalithic tombs are also found in northwestern France, dating to as far back as 4500 BC, about 500 years before they show up in the British Isles or Iberia. These tombs could be reopened, allowing for multiple burials over centuries, and they represent a new tradition in Western Europe, which includes the Long Barrows of Wessex, the Great Passage tombs of the Boyne Valley in Ireland, and many other large passage graves from Scotland to Portugal. In Brittany, we can see a transitional form of monument between the crude dolmens of the early 5th millennium BC and the more elaborate passage tombs which followed them. For example, this is the Barrow of Lanech-er-Gador, which has been carbon dated to between 4500 and 4100 BC and is situated in the Morbihan region of southern Brittany, which has a remarkable concentration of such megalithic monuments. One regional development from the dolmen is known locally as the Covered Alley. This one is on Ile Grande on the north coast of Brittany. It's high up on the island and would have overlooked the sea. The various other megalithic monuments, such as the stone rows and circles, also seem to have developed from the dolmens. Among the earliest of these are the standing menhirs and stone rows, which are all over Brittany. There are between 11 and 1200 standing stones in Brittany. This is the giant menhir of Manio, standing 6.5 metres high, and it overlooks a curious rectangle of megaliths. This is the great menhir of Carnac, which legend holds is guarded by a magic rooster. Christians carved a cross on it. More elaborate Christian imagery was carved on the menhir of Saint-Michel in 1674 to accommodate a persistent form of paganism which endured among the local peasants who worshipped there. Most menhirs can't be dated, as even when datable items are found nearby, they could have been put there long after the erection of the stone. However, the enormous broken menhir at Locmariaquer, which was over 20 meters tall, has been dated to about 4700 BC.
This is the Grand Menhir Brisé. It has been described by experts as possibly the greatest undertaking of human engineering in European prehistory. This stone, before it was broken into these 4 pieces, weighs over 300 tons. And it was part of a line of megaliths. All the rest are missing now, and they're represented by just these piles of stones. That was erected
early in the 5th millennium BC. So this is one of the earliest of all the monuments of the megalith culture. But this menhir was likely famous for a long distance far from Brittany, and may in fact have been one of the catalysts that led to the spread of the megalith culture, and certainly involved the labor of a huge number of people, revealing that there were very complex social organizations and a hierarchy which could call upon the labor of hundreds and hundreds of people. Maybe the majority of the strong men in all of Brittany were involved in the erection of this menhir. But despite that, it was only upright for a few centuries before it fell. And the most likely explanation for why it fell is that there was an earthquake, because seismic activity in this region has been recorded at that time. So that would explain why it has these very clean breaks and why it's fallen in this, exactly where it had previously stood. It seems that after the fall of this menhir, the erection of giant menhirs ceased. So perhaps that cataclysmic event really shook the people who were involved in the religion of these giant menhirs, and they didn't want to do that anymore. They thought that this was a bad omen, perhaps. And it's also interesting that several of the tombs, the giant barrows of the Brittany region that were built in the mid-5th millennium BC, have reused these giant menhirs, which often have, including this one, have carved symbols on the side of them. This one has an image of what's called the axe plough, but is sometimes interpreted as being a sperm whale. But other times there's goats and cows and other things, and they are reused for the local tombs, including the tomb right behind the menhir.
Another of the stones, thought to be from the same row and standing 10 meters tall, was decorated with images of animals and tools, and was broken in half, perhaps by the same earthquake, around 4000 BC. One half now forms the capstone of the adjacent tomb known as Table de Marchands, Table of the Merchants, which was built around 3300 BC, around a large decorated end stone which had been there since approximately 4500 BC. French people were praying to it when I went in. Perhaps they sensed that it was the most special and the oldest stone of the tomb. But these kind of heavily decorated menhirs are not seen after 4000 BC, perhaps due to the earthquake destroying them and thereby changing religious attitudes towards this tradition. You can see the engraved symbols of a hafted axe, a crook, and part of a cow on the menhir, which is now the ceiling. The other half of this broken menhir was found in 1984 to have been used for the capstone of another giant barrow tomb on the nearby island of Gavrinis, which I shall visit later in this film. On it can be seen the rest of the cow from the other half, as well as a goat-like creature and what some have interpreted as a sperm whale. As I said at the start, the stone rows are some of the oldest of all megalithic monuments. Those stone rows at Carnac in Morbihan, southern Brittany, are the most impressive and largest of this type of monument. They're also the oldest. It's very hard to date them, especially because they are unlikely to have been built all in one go, according to a plan for a finished monument, but they have been expanded over the centuries.
However, since part of the Carnac rows pass over the territoire of Le Manio too, it seems that this section at least probably dates to the late 5th millennium BC. Therefore, most of these stones were likely in place over 1,000 years before Stonehenge was finished.
The alignments of Menhir and the alignments of Cornwall, sometimes collectively known as the alignments of Carnac. Alignement in French, what was known in England as stone rows, found on Dartmoor and in Cornwall as well. And certain people like to make a big deal out of the idea that they're somehow aligned with some celestial position of the stars or the sun. But if you look at them, they're not even aligned with each other. None of them are in a straight line, and they do not continue in straight lines. They go up and down hills, curving with the landscape. The size of the stones corresponds to their height along the hill. So as you get higher, they get larger. So it seems that the people who built them were more concerned with altitude than with solar or celestial events of any kind. There is, along this alignment, a dolmen at a corner, at a junction just over there. And that one is actually aligned to face the solstice sunrise, which was a couple of days ago. However, there are many other dolmens in the same region which aren't. So it seems a bit of cherry picking to focus on the one that is when the majority aren't. If you want to make this big argument that the entire megalithic culture was centered around the solstices, it just doesn't add up when you look at all of the megalithic monuments together.
So the builders weren't trying to make exact straight lines, but they did want the larger stones to be higher up for some reason. The longest of the rows, Kercado, Mario, and Menhir, along with Kercado further west, are all aligned roughly west-southwest to east-northeast. So maybe there is some kind of concern with the summer sunrise or winter sunset. But it's pretty higgledy-piggledy, and the smaller rows are not aligned this way at all. Also, some of the rows started out as separate monuments and were later joined up as they were extended. The hillside at Kercado was once littered with large granite blocks and rocky outcrops, increasing in size as you go higher up the hill. Therefore, the stone rows here are simply modifications of a pre-existing natural feature. They simply stood the stones up close to where they were found and arranged them in rows. Experts think that the oldest parts of the rows might be the parts on the hills where we find stone enclosures of various shapes. In this case, the stone rows began as procession paths leading to the enclosures, just like the giant procession path roads leading to the giant stone circle at Avebury in England. The very early Barrow of St Michel, which is the largest barrow on the continent by the way, was built on top of a natural hill. And at the top of an even larger hill overlooking Carnac sits the Kercado passage tomb.
Okay, I'm coming. You're going inside?
Look.
Oh, it looks scary. Are you going to go in?
Yeah.
Go on.
The oldest part of it is the slab-lined hearth underneath the paving stones of its floor, which must have been there at the start of the megalith culture around 4800 BC. Some of this passage tomb barrow dates to much later, maybe as recently as 3800 BC. The incomplete stone circle around the tomb may not be contemporary and is more likely to have been the original monument on this side, which was overlaid with a barrow. It is thought, therefore, that the stone monuments on the biggest hills ended up being overlain by giant barrows and passage graves, while those on the smaller hills were enclosed in stone circles and other enclosures and furnished with processional stone rows, which eventually grew into the massive Carnac stone rows. While it may appear that there was a trend towards preference for hilltop sites in the later Neolithic monuments, since the great Carnac-style tombs of the late 5th and early 4th millennium BC are always in prominent positions, it is likely that these monuments replaced earlier ones. Therefore, the importance of elevated ritual sites may have been an original feature of the megalith cult. One of the clearest windows into the culture of these ancient people, and proof of the significance of the Morbihan region to the megalith culture as a whole, is the extraordinarily high concentration of Jadeite axe heads imported from the Italian Alps to the region during the third quarter of the 5th millennium BC. Each one represents over 1,000 hours of labour and a long journey across France. The axe heads were exported across Europe, but the greatest concentration found outside the Alps is found here in Morbihan. We can't be sure why this is, but one possible explanation is that the region was wealthy from salt production, which was the case in the contemporary Varna culture in Bulgaria. The Varna people were the first to master goldsmithing, and just like the contemporary megalith builders in France, they imported jadeite axe heads from Italy. There is no evidence of salt production in Brittany from that time, but the conditions are just right for it, and so people do it a lot there now. And it would explain the wealth of the region in the Neolithic. A study in 1999 looked at the distribution of 3,257 polished stone axes from Brittany and found that they are much more common in the coastal regions. The highest density is in the Morbihan region around Carnac, and also on the peninsula of Cornwall. It was reported earlier in the 50s that in some of these areas, practically every single field they checked had polished stone axes in. They fetch a pretty penny, so I wish I'd found one. Such axe heads were often placed in groups where they were deposited, standing with the butt in the ground and the cutting edge upwards. Many have compared them to the standing stones which they are often found close to. Across Western Europe, it is mostly only in southern Brittany that large alpine axe heads are placed in the burial tombs, whereas elsewhere they were ritually deposited in seemingly sacred places including caves, bogs, rocky outcrops, or at the foot of menhirs. However, when Cairnholy in Scotland was excavated in 1949, a fragment of a polished jadeite axe head was found in the antechamber of one of the cairns, perhaps showing influence from Brittany. The equivalence between these axe heads and the shaped menhirs is strengthened by the way in which those found in the chamber of the Barrow of St Michel were set vertically into the ground, rather like standing stones. The local giant menhirs have indeed been shaped, and if the giant structures do represent axe heads, then it shows that these were extremely important symbols in this culture.
Another view, one which survives in the folklore of Brittany, Britain, and Ireland, is that the stones represent human figures. But most do not resemble people, in my opinion. This one's obviously a modern creation.
Others say the standing stones are phallic, representing male virility, and the enormous Kercado menhir has a pair of round shapes carved near the bottom that invite comparison to testicles. But the identification of the menhirs as phallic objects does not preclude their identification with the axe heads, because those are phallic too.
This is the Barrow of Mané-er-Hroëck.
Oh, it's very dark in this one and very low. There's a ceiling. You have to crawl in this one. It's not like the others at all, and it's so low down underground. You have to go down a staircase to get in. It's the spookiest one of all.
Among the grave goods inside was a polished stone axe, positioned as though penetrating a green stone ring. These polished stone rings were introduced to Brittany from the Paris Basin and are testament to the genealogical link between these two regions. In this context, they appear to function like an Indian yoni and lingam, therefore representing sexual intercourse. The axe heads in Brittany were reshaped and polished even more after being imported, so that they conformed to the preferred local style, a style which is also depicted on the rock carvings on the interior of the cairn of Gavrinis island off the coast of Morbihan. The Tumiac barrow, or butte de Caesar, had 18 jade axes inside, while the enormous Barrow of St Michel had 13. These high concentrations of exotic jade axes in the large tombs of Carnac, combined with the impressive scale of the monuments themselves, reinforces the argument that these were the product of an intense concentration of power, wealth, and authority, centered around a privileged, perhaps sacred elite whose bodies were interred within. A French study by Petraquin and colleagues sent a team out to the remote islands of Western Papua, where the natives of the Sentani tribe produced similar kinds of polished stone axe heads. These people sometimes sourced special jade stones for the axes from far away. The researchers were permitted to visit the quarry used for normal axe heads, but not the special quarry, the rocks of which were reserved exclusively for the elite and hereditary chiefs. This can be compared to customs in ancient China and Mesoamerica, where jadeite was also reserved for the elite and for the gods. The study concludes that the jade axe heads of Brittany are status symbols shrouded in imaginary interpretations of ritual significance, and that their high concentration in Morbihan is evidence of a highly inegalitarian society.
The aforementioned Passy graves were not megalithic. They were made from earth and timber, and the preceding linear pottery or LBK culture of the 6th millennium BC, which spread to France from Germany, had no monumental grave or megalith tradition. But there is still the possibility that it influenced the megalith culture. The LBK culture is renowned for its huge longhouses made of timber, wattle and daub, and which were the largest freestanding buildings in the world at that time. The westward expansion of the LBK culture into France is called the Villeneuve-Saint-Germain culture, or VSG for short. They had similar ceramic decorations and tools to the LBK, but their houses were more trapezoidal in shape compared to the typically rectangular LBK houses. Their descendants in the Sarni culture in the Paris Basin are the ones who made the early non-megalithic long barrows. At Balloy, 20 miles north of Passy, they built graves and long barrows directly over the top of earlier VSG longhouses that had been abandoned for over 200 years. The tradition of VSG longhouses expanded all the way to Brittany and finally as far as the south coast of Morbihan. Large barrows with accessible megalithic chambers appeared in Brittany from the mid-5th millennium BC. You can't enter them now, but the Tumiac barrow and the Barrow of St Michel contain such chambers, as you can see in this diagram. There are 7 such tombs near Carnac. While I said earlier that the use of large stones in these grave monuments may derive from a native tradition among Brittany's hunter-gatherers, there are also striking parallels between the early barrows and the older VSG longhouses. For example, a VSG longhouse at Locmariaquer in East Brittany, shown above, closely matches the layout of the Tartre, or Barrow of Locmariaquer near Carnac, shown beneath it. So in short, the long barrow comes from the longhouse. VSG style pottery has been found at Kercado near Carnac, and the nearby cairn of Hroëck, which is 140 meters long and dated between 4300 and 4200 BC, echoes the shape of trapezoid VSG longhouses from over 500 years earlier. The cairn contained a mini jadeite axe pendant, a bit like a Thor's hammer, variscite beads, likely from Iberia, and a large variscite oblong pendant with 5 variscite disc beads. The central section contained a small stone-built chamber roofed by a megalithic capstone, which is a fragment of an older standing stone. It was restored in 1992 and may once have been larger, but it was never very tall, always having this long, low appearance. It lies right next to the Great Broken Megalith and the Table de Marchands barrow. I'll need a boat to reach the next tomb I'm visiting. The tomb of Gavrinis stands atop an island in the middle of the Gulf of Morbihan. But 6,000 years ago, the sea was about 5 meters lower, so this area was a marshy plain crossed by rivers. Back then, you could reach the Barrow of Gavrinis on foot, but it was at the top of a hill, visible from far away. My son was as excited as I was to get inside. The giant barrow is 50 meters wide and more than 6 meters high. It was built between 6,200 and 6,000 years ago. All the stones in the passage are decorated with patterns. Some patterns are broken by the later addition of axes, bows, and arrows. The 3 holes in slab C1 in the main chamber were man-made. Who knows what for? As far as I know, they are unique. The interior really reminded me a lot of New Grange in Ireland, which was built about 1,000 years later. The passage faces east, and some believe it faces the sunset on winter solstice, so that it shines into the chamber, although this has yet to be proven. The adjacent island of Lanique boasts 2 horseshoe-shaped megalith enclosures, which can be compared to the hilltop enclosures of Carnac. 2.4 miles south of Gavrinis, on a promontory overlooking the Quiberon Bay, stands another giant cairn, known as Petit Mont. Its position shows a concern with the sea, and evidently it was intended to be visible from the sea. Standing atop the cairn today, you can see for miles. It was built in several stages, starting around 6,600 years ago with an earthen barrow. 100 years later, the first non-accessible stone cairn was built on top of the barrow. 5,800 years ago, they built another cairn with an accessible chamber inside, which today can only be accessed via a bunker built by Germans during World War II. Spooky.
Look! Look
Spooky room.
Look! Up there, that's a ghost king. Look up there.
Is that a ghost
That's
king?
the light. That's the light from a ghost king. That's the light for a ghost king, Daddy.
The light for a ghost king to see. "900 years later, a third cairn was constructed, which is 4,700 years ago, towards the end of the Neolithic. This impressive entrance feels like the main entrance today. The 9-meter passage leads to a chamber with decorated stones. Some are typical Neolithic designs. While others are clearly later additions from the Iron Age, like this pair of feet. Or this 17-spoked wheel. Spoked wheels were not invented until the Bronze Age. The tomb was reused by local Gallic Celts in the Iron Age, who left plates, ceramics and other domestic items inside. In Roman times, the tomb seems to have once again become a cult site, as we find fragments of figurines and idols of different deities, mostly Venus, who it seems was then associated with the cairn. Just as the Iron Age Gauls and then the Romans reinterpreted these Neolithic monuments according to their own beliefs, that process has continued through the ages, with modern people assigning all kinds of new meanings to the monuments that they never originally had. For example, in the early 20th century, anthropologists such as Margaret Mead in the 1930s and later Maria Gimbutas in the 1950s attempted to interpret Neolithic and other primitive cultures in the context of feminist and egalitarian beliefs. And as a result, there's a whole heritage of scholarship associated with Neolithic Europe that associates that culture with a more egalitarian or even matriarchal culture that never existed. Besides the evidence I presented in this film, talking about the Jadeite axe heads and the findings of Petroquin and colleagues, there have also been more recent genetic studies that have conclusively debunked the works of Maria Gimbutas and others. In 2020, Cassidy and colleagues looked at the DNA of the people in the Newgrange Passage tomb and other major megalithic monuments in Ireland and found that they all belong to a very closely related elite. So closely related that many of them were heavily inbred. And what that showed is that there was high social stratification with a very privileged elite who were capable of commanding enormous amounts of labour of all the men in the region to construct these huge monuments. And we can tell from looking at the bones of the so-called God King of Newgrange that he didn't do any manual labour in his life. So we can tell that the people who are being put in these tombs are not the people who were buried in them. But what about the normal people? What about their burials? We don't even know how their bodies were disposed of. Their history is not recorded. Only the elites of the Neolithic have these extravagant tombs, and that is a clear sign of inequality. Another study in 2022 found more evidence for this. This one looked at the family contained within Hazelton Longbarrow in England.
Now, of course, they were all related. And this shows that these elites cared about kinship, they cared about family, and that they were tribalist. And the data from both papers also demonstrates, when we look at the haplogroup phylogenies of the male lineages, that these families and kinship groups were patrilineally defined, and that's typical of a patriarchal society. What matters is who your dad is. If your dad is one of the elites, then you're one of the elites too. And that's typical of most societies we look at in history. There's also a widespread belief, for some reason, that Neolithic people were peaceful. But that's contradicted by archaeological finds as far apart as Slovakia and England, where horrific mass burials have been discovered, such as the one at Crickley Hill in Gloucestershire. We're talking like women and children massacred. These were not peaceful people. These were not feminist people. These were not egalitarian people. When we look at these magnificent great tombs of Brittany and the associated megalithic structures, we should think of them in rather the same terms that we regard the pyramids of ancient Egypt. Now, those were created by pharaohs, elites, who were regarded as sacred god kings, who were, due to their sacral power, able to command thousands of people in coordinated labor to create the sort of monuments that people are still celebrating and in awe of thousands of years later. And 6,500 years after the great tombs of Brittany were built, we still admire their handiwork, even though we don't know anything much about the people who actually built them with their hands, compared to what we know about the people who were buried within, the god kings. Thanks for watching Survive the Jive.